In 1906, in the grand dining hall of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, John Harvey Kellogg moved among the most powerful men in America in a white suit and set before them a bowl of dry flaked corn. That year, the sanitarium took in 7,006 guests, held 1,250 patients under a staff of 1,800, and would register President William Howard Taft as its 100,000th arrival. All of it ran on the doctrine of one physician in a small Michigan town who believed the human appetite for pleasure was not a weakness but a disease to be cured. But the story of the man who taught America how to eat breakfast is also the story of a marriage of 41 years he never consummated, acid and the surgeon's knife prescribed as punishment for the flesh, a fortune poured into a foundation for breeding a better race, and two brothers who would end as enemies in a courtroom over a single word. The Palace of Presidents would stand 3 more decades. Then, in the winter of 1933, a court would take it away. The doctrine that filled that dining hall had a beginning, and the beginning was not medicine. It was faith. Chapter 1. The Creed that Forbade Everything. By the middle of the 19th century, the small town of Battle Creek, Michigan, had become the center of a new American church, and that church held unusual convictions about the human body. The Seventh-day Adventists taught that the body was a temple lent by God, and that to defile it with drink, with tobacco, or with rich and stimulating food was not merely unhealthy, but sinful. At the heart of the movement stood Ellen G. White, whose visions carried the force of prophecy, and who preached that the reform of health belonged to salvation as surely as the keeping of the Sabbath. White had drawn in turn on an older American voice, the reformer Sylvester Graham, who for decades had argued that meat and spice and pleasure at the table inflamed the animal passions, and that a plain, coarse, unseasoned diet was the road to a governed body and a governed soul. From Graham came the dense brown bread that still bears his name. From White came a church with the will and the money to turn the creed into an institution of its own. Into that world came a boy named John Harvey Kellogg. The church marked him early. It paid for his medical education and sent him away to be trained so that the gospel of health might one day be carried by a man who could sign it with a physician's name. Then it called him home. In 1876, at the age of 24, Kellogg took charge of the church's own struggling health establishment on the edge of town, the Western Health Reform Institute, a small water cure house that treated its patients with baths, rest, and Graham's plain food. When he took it, the institute was a marginal thing. A decade before, in 1866, it had counted 106 patrons across an entire year, and it survived on the loyalty of the faithful and the charity of the church that had built it. It stood nearer to closing than to greatness. Kellogg did not intend to leave it that way. Within a few years, he had renamed the place the Battle Creek Sanitarium and begun rebuilding it into something its founders had never pictured, a health establishment run less like a hospital than like a temple, with a single doctrine and a single presiding mind. That doctrine he called biologic living, and its rules were absolute. No meat, no alcohol, no tobacco, no tea, no coffee, no spices, and no condiments of any kind. The food that came out of his kitchens was deliberately, almost defiantly, bland, and the blandness was the whole point. Kellogg had inherited from White and from Graham a conviction that ran deeper than digestion. He believed that stimulating food did not merely tax the stomach, but roused the appetites, and that the appetites, once roused, drew the body away from health and the soul away from grace. To eat plainly was to think plainly. To deny the tongue was to begin to master the flesh. It is possible to look at what Kellogg built in those first years and see a physician far ahead of his age. He condemned tobacco in a decade when cigarettes were sold as remedies and recommended by doctors. He warned against liquor, against overeating, against the sedentary indoor life, and pressed exercise, fresh air, sunlight, and clean water upon a public that had heard almost none of it. Much of what he demanded in 1876 would be reprinted as ordinary good sense 100 years later. It is equally possible to look at the same man and see something colder. A moralist in a white coat who had dressed the oldest religious dread of the body in the new and unanswerable language of science, and who was quietly assembling, in a small Michigan town, an institution with the authority to tell people not only what to eat, but what they were permitted to want. Both readings are supported by the record. For the plainness of the Battle Creek table was never only a matter of the stomach. Kellogg had come to believe that the body's most dangerous hunger was not hunger at all, and that the true labor of biologic living was to find that other appetite and starve it at the root. The bland food, the baths, the machines, the whole vast apparatus he was about to raise would in time be bent toward a single conviction that the young doctor was only beginning to speak aloud. He had decided that the wanting itself was the enemy, and he meant to cure it. Chapter 2. The War on Desire. The appetite that Kellogg meant to cure had a name, and he was not reluctant to name it. Among all the hungers that could unseat a governed body, he judged one to be the most corrupting, the most secret, and the most widely indulged. It was the sexual appetite. In 1877, the year after he took charge of the Institute, he gathered the whole of his thinking on it into a book, and that book made him, for a time, as familiar to American parents as anything he would later put into a cereal bowl. He called it Plain Facts for Old and Young. It presented itself as a household manual of health, a guide to courtship, to marriage, and to the raising of children. And in that guise it sold by the hundreds of thousands and took a place on the shelves of respectable homes across the country. Beneath the domestic surface, though, the book carried one great animating subject, and Kellogg pursued it with the concentration of a man tracking a plague. That subject was masturbation, which he named self-abuse, and which he ranked among the most destructive forces at work on the health of the young. In this he was a man of his century as much as the author of his own creed. The dread of the solitary habit ran through 19th-century medicine like a fault line, and respectable physicians on both sides of the Atlantic had taught for decades that the body held a fixed store of vital force, and that to spend it in secret was to drain away health, reason, and years of life. Kellogg took that inherited fear and gave it the full weight of his authority, his institution, and his tireless pen. Where others had warned, he systematized. He set himself to describe the enemy completely. To Kellogg, the vice was not a moral failing merely, but a medical catastrophe, the hidden root of a long train of afflictions that ran from weakness and poor posture to epilepsy, insanity, and early death. He furnished parents with a long list of signs by which a child might be exposed, and the signs were such ordinary things as shyness and boldness, pallor, and a want of energy, so that scarcely a trait of any real child could not, under an anxious eye, be read as proof of the secret sin. A parent who went searching, armed with his catalogue, was unlikely to come away reassured. The doctrine did not stop at the nursery. What Kellogg taught parents to fear in their children, he taught his grown patients to fear in themselves, and the men and women who came to Battle Creek for their nerves or their digestion were enrolled, whether they had asked for it or not, in the same campaign against their own excitements. The war on desire was not a private corner of his medicine. It was the hidden architecture beneath the whole of it, the reason the food was dull, the reason the day was filled from waking to sleep so that no idle hour was left in which the flesh might stir. It was against this danger, more than against any ailment of the stomach, that the plain food of Battle Creek was built. Kellogg had taken up the teaching of Ellen White and Sylvester Graham, who held that a diet of bland food served, in the words long used to describe his aim, to minimize excitement, sexual arousal, and masturbation. Spice and meat and richness at the table roused the body. A cooled body was a governable one. The bland meals, the cold baths, the long hours of exercise, the enforced routine of the sanitarium were not separate enthusiasms, but a single apparatus turned to a single end, to lower the temperature of the flesh until desire itself fell quiet. The food was one instrument within that program. It was not, whatever later retellings would insist, a device aimed at any single act. It was the entire regime set against the condition of wanting. For the child already caught, Kellogg turned from prevention to correction, and here the record speaks in his own voice. In plain facts, he set down what ought to be done, and he set it down in the same even tone he gave to his counsel on ventilation, sleep, and dress. For a boy, he recommended circumcision, and he was exact about the conditions. The operation, he wrote, should be carried out by a surgeon without administering an anesthetic, as the brief pain attending the operation will have a salutary effect upon the mind, especially if it be connected with the idea of punishment. For a girl, he prescribed the application of pure carbolic acid to the clitoris. He offered these not as cruelties, but as treatments, and he kept them in the book through edition after edition as it was enlarged across the following decade. The distinction he drew was his own, and he held to it. The surgery and the acid were corrections, meted out to those the habit had already taken. The food and the regimen were prevention, laid over the whole body of his patients so that the habit might never take hold at all. Both belonged to one doctrine. The plain diet that would one day feed the world its breakfast and the carbolic acid prescribed for a girl's body were, in Kellogg's account, two applications of a single governing idea that the human appetite for pleasure was a sickness and that the physician's task was to put it down. There is one further fact about the book, and it belongs less to medicine than to the man who wrote it. Kellogg did not compose plain facts as a distant bachelor theorist. He wrote and enlarged much of it in the first years of his own marriage, some of it, by more than one account, during the honeymoon itself. The physician who was teaching a nation to distrust its own desire had lately taken a wife. What that marriage was, and what across 41 years it never became, is the next entry in the record, and it is stranger than anything in the book. Chapter 3. The Marriage That Never Was. He took a wife in the same season that he was teaching the country to fear its own desire. Her name was Ella Eaton. She had come to Battle Creek as a young woman of education, trained in the sciences, and drawn to the doctor's cause, and in 1879 the two of them were married. What passed between them across the years that followed has come down less as a marriage than as a partnership in a doctrine, and the way it began set the terms for everything after. They spent their wedding journey at work. While couples of their station traveled or rested, the Kelloggs sat together over the manuscript of plain facts, the very book that ranked the appetite they were now expected to share among the gravest dangers to human health. By more than one account, the pages were enlarged in the first weeks of the marriage itself. The honeymoon of the physician who preached against desire was given over to the anti-sex book. It was, in its way, an honest opening. It promised nothing it did not intend to keep. They kept separate bedrooms from the start, and they kept them for 41 years. By Kellogg's own creed, the marriage was never consummated. He had written that a governed body spent no vital force in secret, and he governed his own to the letter, holding his wife at the distance the doctrine required. Whatever ran between them ran along other channels. They worked side by side over his books and his diets and the running of the institution, and together they built a literature and an empire. What they did not build was the ordinary intimacy the marriage was, on its face, supposed to contain. And yet the house above the sanitarium was not a silent one. It was full of children. The Kelloggs had none by birth, and by the terms of the doctrine, they never would. Instead, they took in the children of others, and they took them in by the dozens. Across the years, more than 40 passed through the household as foster children, and at least 7 were legally adopted and given the Kellogg name. They arrived from broken homes and from no homes at all, some as infants, some already half-grown, gathered into a family that could not have come about in any ordinary way. The house ran on a schedule as exact as the one that ordered the patients below it. There were long tables at mealtimes, and the same plain food the doctor prescribed for the sick, set now before children who had known a plainer kind of hunger before they came. There were lessons and chores and the ceaseless traffic of a large household, and moving through the middle of it was a man who could be, to the small and the newly arrived, unexpectedly gentle. The physician who had written that a child's shyness might betray a secret vice also knew the names of the youngest under his roof and carried them on his shoulders. For the household was a laboratory as much as a home. The children were raised on the biologic regimen from their first meal, their diets kept plain, their days measured out by the same principles the doctor was selling to the country. The warmth in those rooms was real. So was the creed that shaped every hour spent in them, and the creed did not soften for being turned on the young. The affection and the experiment lived under one roof, at the same tables, in the same governed hours, and the children grew up inside both at once, unable to tell where the one left off and the other began. This was the private architecture of the man, a marriage held at arm's length by principle, and a house of borrowed children raised as proof that the principle could build a family without the thing it forbade. It was a small kingdom ordered from waking to sleep, and its ruler asked nothing of it he had not first demanded of himself. The marriage that never was, and the house full of gathered children, were the doctrine kept behind closed doors, tried first on the doctor and those nearest to him. It would not stay behind those doors. The regimen he had proved on his own body and his own household was about to be offered to the world, and the world was already on its way to Battle Creek to receive it. The most powerful people in America would come to that small Michigan town by the thousands, and they would come to obey. Chapter 4. The Palace Where Presidents Obeyed. By 1906, the Battle Creek Sanitarium stood at the height of its reach, and the man who ran it had made obedience the first condition of the cure. People did not travel to Battle Creek to rest. They came to be governed. From the hour a guest arrived, the day stopped being his own and became the doctrine's, and the doctrine kept a schedule as exact as the one that ordered the doctor's own house. The regimen Kellogg had first proved on his own body was now a machine of ours, and it ran on every guest alike, whatever he was worth. The food was the plain, fleshless fare of biologic living: no meat, no alcohol, no tobacco, no coffee or tea, nothing sharpened by a condiment, nothing set on the table to please the tongue rather than serve the body. Around the meals ran the rest of the method the place had grown famous for: the water treatments, and the measured exercise, and the long routines of cleansing, each applied on a timetable and recorded like the reading of an instrument. There were lectures to sit through and rules to keep, and a physician in a white suit who moved through the whole of it, presiding over how a wealthy stranger spent his morning. A man who commanded thousands of his own workers surrendered his plate, his hours, and his habits at the door, and did as he was told. For all its severity, the sanitarium was no grim ward. It was among the grandest resorts in the country, a place of long halls and gardens, and nearly every comfort a fortune could expect, with the single exception of the comforts the doctor had ruled out. The wealthy arrived expecting to be indulged, and found instead that they had checked into a kind of monastery with marble floors, where the surroundings were opulent and the pleasures were forbidden. Presiding over the contradiction, day after day, was Kellogg himself. He lectured his guests in person, standing before rooms of industrialists and their wives, to explain the workings of their own bodies and the dangers of the food they had eaten all their lives. He was the institution's physician, its architect, and its performer at once, and the guests who had come to be cured stayed to be held by the certainty of the man curing them. And the doctor's reach ran well past the walls of the place. What was tried on the guests at Battle Creek, Kellogg pressed on the whole of the country through a steady output of books and pamphlets and health writing, so that the thousands who came each year to take the cure in person were only the visible edge of a far larger following who kept his rules at a distance, in their own kitchens, on his word alone. The sanitarium was the flagship of a national doctrine, and the men who walked its halls had come to the source of a creed they had already been reading at home. They came anyway, and they came in numbers that climbed year upon year. Some came because the regimen worked, or seemed to. Some came because the doctor had turned the plainest possible living into the fashion of the age, so that going without at Battle Creek carried the prestige that indulgence carried everywhere else. Whatever drew them, the ledgers kept the count, and the count tells the story of the empire better than any single visitor could. In 1866, the year the institution first opened its doors under the Adventists, it received 106 patrons across the whole of the year. 40 years later, in 1906, it received 7,006. At its height, it held 1,250 patients at a time, tended by a staff of 1,800. President William Howard Taft was entered in its register as the 100,000th guest to pass through its doors. Its roll of patients read like an index of the American century. Thomas Edison and Henry Ford, the aviator Amelia Earhart, and John D. Rockefeller, Jr., heir to the largest fortune the country had yet produced. 4 presidents praised it from public platforms: Taft, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. The most powerful people in America had found their way to a small town in southern Michigan, and they had come to do as one doctor instructed. That was the improbable center of the thing. The men who ran the nation's industry and the men who ran the nation itself put themselves under the authority of a single physician, and that physician's founding conviction was that the very appetite that had carried so many of them was, to him, a sickness to be broken. He did not soften the creed for the powerful. He set before them the same plain food he set before the foster children in his house, and the patients, too poor to be famous, held them to the same governed hours, and told them, in his lectures and his books, that the wanting itself was the disease. And they listened. They paid to be told. The wealth of the age arranged its mornings around the rules of a man who regarded its pleasures as an illness, and called the arrangement a cure. The strangest part of that empire was never the role of the powerful who filled its halls. It was the food. The plain, unexciting fare the doctor set before presidents had been worked out in a back kitchen by hands he scarcely troubled to notice, and one of its accidents was about to leave that kitchen, take the family name, and feed a world that would never once set foot in Battle Creek. The sanitarium was the empire John Harvey Kellogg built on purpose. The thing that would outlast it and outrun him, he made by mistake. Chapter 5. The Fortune Made by Accident. The food came from a back kitchen, and the back kitchen came from a problem. Biologic living forbade nearly everything a 19th-century table was built on. No meat, no rich sauces, no coffee to start the morning, nothing fried or spiced or sweetened for the pleasure of it. What the doctrine allowed was grain, plainly prepared, and grain plainly prepared was heavy, dull, and hard on the digestions of guests who had spent their lives eating better. Kellogg needed a food that obeyed the creed and could still be set before a paying industrialist without driving him back to the world outside. So he built an experimental kitchen inside the sanitarium and told it to solve the thing the doctrine had made difficult, which was how to feed people well on food designed to excite them as little as possible. He did not work the kitchen himself. He lectured, he wrote, he presided. The labor of the ovens fell to others, and two of them mattered. One was his wife, Ella Eaton Kellogg, who ran the experimental kitchen and its cooking school and tested recipes by the hundred against the rules her husband had laid down. The other was his younger brother. Will Keith Kellogg had come to Battle Creek to work for John Harvey, and work was the whole of what he did. He kept the sanitarium's books. He managed its accounts and its supplies. He swept its floors when the floors needed sweeping and mixed the food preparations when the kitchen needed hands, on a clerk's wage and less regard. A subordinate so completely a subordinate that the doctor is said to have dictated letters to him while sitting on the toilet, unwilling to lose the minutes. For years the younger brother was the machinery beneath the great man's performance, unthanked in any way that showed, unnamed in the story the sanitarium told about itself. He was the one part of the great machine its master never once stopped to see, and it was in that kitchen, over that plain problem, that the accident happened. The brothers were trying to make a substitute for bread, a wholesome grain food a weak stomach could take, and they were working with boiled wheat, forcing it through rollers to press it into thin sheets. One batch of the boiled wheat was left standing far longer than it should have been. When they ran the stale-tempered dough through the rollers, it did not come out as a sheet. It broke apart, and it came out in flakes, one thin flake for every grain of wheat. They baked the flakes, and in place of a ruined batch, they had something no one had made before, a light, dry, toasted cereal that a sick body could keep down and a well one could stand to eat. They called it granose and set it before the patients, and the patients wanted more of it than the kitchen could turn out. What had begun as a way to obey the diet had become the most popular thing the diet produced. A few years on, the same trick was worked on corn in place of wheat, and the corn came off the rollers lighter and sweeter to the tongue than the wheat had ever been, and the flake that would one day carry the family around the world was sitting on the table. It arrived exactly as the wheat flake had, out of the effort to build a plain and unexciting food for a plain and unexciting regimen. That origin is worth holding on to because the century that inherited the cornflake would tell a stranger story about it. The tale hardened into a claim that the doctor had built the flake on purpose, a bland food engineered as a cure for the body's appetites, a thing made to put down desire. The record does not carry the claim. The flake was not aimed at anything so precise. It fell out of the larger program, the doctrine of plain living the doctor had already built for reasons of his own, a regimen meant to quiet the body's excitements in general and to feed the sanitarium's guests within the rules. The cornflake was a byproduct of that program and not its weapon. It was an accident of the diet, and the diet's purposes were older and wider than any single food that happened to come out of it. Kellogg saw at once that he had made something the world beyond Battle Creek would pay for. He patented the flaking process, formed a company to sell the cereals by mail to former patients who wanted the sanitarium's food in their own homes, and folded the returns back into the institution. But he never quite saw the flake for what it could be. To the doctor, it was a health food, an extension of the doctrine, one more instrument of biologic living, and he guarded it the way he guarded everything, as a thing that belonged to the creed. What he did not see was that the future of the family had just been made in a back kitchen by the brother he counted for the least, and that it did not belong to the creed at all. It belonged to whoever was willing to do the one thing the doctor would never permit, which was to make the flake taste good enough for people who were not sick and had no wish to be cured. Will Keith saw it. He had made the thing with his own hands, across the years of sweeping and bookkeeping, and he watched his brother treat the discovery as a footnote to the lectures. The seed of a fortune had been planted in the man the doctor noticed least, and it would be a long time germinating. First, the empire itself would have to be tried, and the faith that had founded it would have to break. On a February night not many years off, the temple John Harvey Kellogg had raised was going to burn to the ground. Chapter 6. The Night the Temple Burned. The fire came in the early hours of the 18th of February, 1902, and by the time the morning light reached Battle Creek, the great building was gone. The sanitarium that had taken a quarter of a century to raise, the health palace where a sitting president and the richest men in the country had come to submit themselves to a doctor's rules, burned through the night until there was almost nothing left of it but the ground it had stood on. Fire moved through the old wooden structure the way it moves through anything built to hold a crowd, and it took the treatment rooms and the lecture halls, the apparatus and the records, the whole physical body of a philosophy of living, all of it going up at once in the winter dark. The patients were brought out into the cold. The building that had made Kellogg's name was ash before the town was fully awake. A different kind of man might have read the fire as a verdict. Kellogg read it as an interruption. He did not stand in the ruins and grieve for what a quarter century had built, because to his mind the doctrine did not live in the timber and could not die with it, and the institution that carried the doctrine to the world, therefore, could not be allowed to stay dead. Within days he had resolved not merely to replace what had burned, but to raise something larger in its place, a bigger building, a grander one, fireproof this time, sized to the empire the first one had only begun to become. He drove the work forward with the certainty of a man who believed the world could not be permitted to do without him, and on the 31st of May, 1903, a little more than a year after the fire, the new Battle Creek Sanitarium opened its doors, taller and heavier and more imposing than the temple that had stood there before. It was the way he paid for it that did the lasting damage. The sanitarium had never been Kellogg's own property in the first place. It had been founded by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, raised out of the health reform gospel of Ellen White, built as an arm of the faith that had taken the boy John Harvey up and sent him to his training. The doctor had always run the place as though it were his, and for years the distance between running a thing and owning it had been easy enough to leave unmeasured. The rebuilding forced the measurement. To finance a structure on that scale, Kellogg raised and committed the institution's future in ways the church had not sanctioned and would not bless, and the men who had founded the sanitarium watched their institution grow into something that answered to the doctor and no longer to them. What had been a quiet disagreement about authority became an open one about ownership, and about whether the empire rising in Battle Creek still belonged to the creed that had planted it. The church had seen it coming and had said so. From the edges of the movement, the warning had been the same for years, that the doctor was building a monument to his own methods rather than a ministry of the faith, that the science had crowded out the scripture, that a man cannot serve a gospel and an empire at once, and that Kellogg had long since chosen the empire. The larger the new building rose, the plainer the warning looked. An institution founded to carry the health message of a church now carried, above all, the reputation of one physician, and the physician had no intention of handing it back. The rupture did not mend. It widened until the church did the only thing left to do with a member who would not submit to it, and expelled him. The founder of the Battle Creek Sanitarium was put out of the Seventh-day Adventist Church that had founded the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and the two never reconciled. He had kept the institution and lost the faith. He would have said, if pressed, that he had lost nothing at all, that biologic living was the truer creed, and the sanitarium its truer temple, and that a man who had cured the powerful of the whole earth did not need a church to tell him he was right. But something had changed, and the change was the beginning of the unease that would run under everything that followed. The sanitarium was larger now and grander, and it was his in a way it had never quite been before, cut loose from the faith that had disciplined it and answerable to no authority but the doctor's own conviction. It drew the world to its doors in greater numbers than ever, and among the sick and the wealthy who came to Battle Creek to be cured were men who would study what Kellogg had built, take the method for themselves, and carry it back out through the gates the fire had rebuilt. Chapter 7. The Patient Who Stole the Doctrine. He came to Battle Creek in 1891, the way the others came, a sick man looking to be made well, and for a time he was only one more name in the register of a place that admitted thousands. Charles William Post arrived at the sanitarium as a patient. He submitted to the regime, ate the deliberately bland food, and took the water cures and sat through the daily lectures, and when he left, he carried out through the gates something no bill of treatment had charged him for. He had watched how the thing worked. He had seen a doctrine turned into a routine, and a routine turned into a business, and he understood, as the doctor in his certainty never troubled to, that the method did not belong to the man who had invented it. It belonged to whoever could sell it. What Post took was not a recipe. It was an idea about what people would buy. Kellogg had built a temple and required the sick to come to it, up the long drives and through the doors and into the wards, one paying body at a time. Post grasped that the far larger market was everyone who would never set foot in Battle Creek, and yet would gladly pay to carry a piece of biologic living home. The doctrine forbade coffee. And so, in 1895, Post put out a hot-grain drink to stand in coffee's place and called it postum, a thing a man could buy off a grocer's shelf and pour at his own table without ever taking the cure or submitting to the doctor who prescribed it. 2 years later, in 1897, came grape nuts, sold not as the byproduct of a health philosophy, but as the health philosophy itself, poured into a box and shipped by the rail car. Post Toasties followed it onto the same shelves. Where Kellogg had preached, Post advertised, and the advertising traveled further than any lecture in Battle Creek had ever carried. The genius of it, and the insult of it, was that Post had not stolen a single secret. He had stolen the whole enterprise in plain sight and paid the admission fee to do it. Everything he sold, he had first been served as a patient. The vegetarian regimen, the suspicion of rich food, the promise that the right breakfast could set a body right, the grain flake and the grain drink that the sanitarium's own kitchens had worked out under Kellogg's roof. Post had swallowed all of it as medicine and walked out understanding it as merchandise. He kept the gospel and dropped the priest, and the market rewarded him for the exchange at a scale the priest had never imagined. The numbers told the story of the theft more plainly than the products did. By 1908 and 1909, the Post concern had run past $5 million in sales, a fortune built in less than a decade and a half out of a method its founder had received for the price of a patient's stay, inside the walls of the very institution that now had to stand and watch him prosper. The doctor who taught that pleasure was a disease had, without ever meaning to, shown a former patient how to feed the appetite of an entire nation and grow rich on the feeding. Every box that left Post's plant carried a little of Kellogg's doctrine out into the world and brought none of the money back. And Post was only the first through the gap he had opened. What one patient had proved could be done, others rushed to do, and they did not trouble to be original about it. They came to Battle Creek because Post had come to Battle Creek, and they set up their kitchens and their mills in the same small Michigan town for no better reason than that the name of the place had begun to mean health in a box, and the name could be borrowed. In the boom's first decade, more than 80 cereal companies stood in some stage of existence there, rising and merging and failing and rising again, each one selling some version of the flake or the grain food that had been worked out inside the sanitarium as a treatment and was now sold on every corner as a breakfast. The town that had been known, if it was known at all, for a doctor and his health palace, became known for the industry the doctor had accidentally seeded. Battle Creek became Cereal City, and the men who made it so were, nearly to a man, people who had learned the trade at Kellogg's expense and kept the profit for themselves. The doctrine had escaped him. It had walked out of the sanitarium in the memory of a cured patient and multiplied into an industry that answered to no doctor and honored no creed, that took the anti-excitement diet Kellogg had built to discipline the body and sold it back to the country as a pleasure, sweetened and boxed and advertised. The thing he had made to cure the world was making other men fortunes across the street, and there was nothing in his authority or his certainty that could call it home. He could disown all of them. He could call Post a thief, and the 80 imitators a rabble, and in his own mind he did. But the one imitator he could never disown, the one who would take not merely the method but the name itself, was not a stranger who had come to Battle Creek by rail. He had been in the back rooms of the sanitarium the whole time, keeping the ledgers and sweeping the floors, watching everything, and he was Kellogg's own brother. Chapter 8. The Brother Who Took the Name. For 25 years, Will Keith had kept his brother's books and swept his brother's floors, and in all that time the doctor had regarded him as a fixture, a useful and silent part of the sanitarium's back rooms, owed no more notice than the boilers or the linen. He was the younger man by 8 years, the one who had left school early to work, who counted the receipts and managed the accounts and did the 1,000 unglamorous things that kept the great institution solvent while John Harvey lectured in the wards and posed for the photographers in his white suit. When the toasted flake was worked out in the experimental kitchen, it was Will Keith who had stood at the rollers through the long nights, and Will Keith who understood, in a way the doctor never troubled to, what the thin sheet of toasted grain might be worth to a country that would never once come to Battle Creek to be cured. What he understood was the same thing Post had carried out through the sanitarium gates, and it turned on a single ingredient the doctor had forbidden. The cornflake, as John Harvey made it, was a health food, which is to say it was dutiful and plain, engineered to excite nothing in the body that ate it, faithful to the whole anti-excitement doctrine. It did not taste good, and it was never meant to. Will Keith grasped that a food which did not taste good could be prescribed but could not be sold, and that the entire distance between the two was sugar. He wanted to put sugar on the flake. To the doctor, this was not a disagreement about commerce. It was heresy. Sugar was pleasure, and pleasure was the enemy the whole sanitarium had been raised to defeat, and to sweeten the flake was to take the one product that carried the doctrine out into the world and aim it back at everything the doctrine stood for. The brothers had quarreled for years already over the commercial rights to the flake, over who owned the process and what a man was permitted to do with it, in a tangle of small companies and shifting agreements whose particulars need not be traced here to feel their temperature. In 1906, Will Keith ended the argument the only way it could be ended, by act rather than by persuasion. He founded his own company in Battle Creek to manufacture the sweetened cornflake and sell it to the ordinary public on the open grocery shelf, poured at any family's table under his own management with the sugar in it. He was 46 years old, and for the first time in a working life spent inside his brother's shadow, he answered to no one above him. And on the front of every carton that left his new plant, in the red script that would in time become one of the most recognized marks in the world, he put the family name. That last decision was the one that could not be recalled, and it was the one the doctor would not abide. The name was not an incidental. John Harvey had spent 30 years building it into a word the sick trusted and the powerful repeated, a word that on a box promised the authority of the sanitarium itself, and he had been selling foods under that name through concerns of his own. Now 2 companies stood in one small Michigan town, both stamping cornflakes with the single name Kellogg, and the grocers and the customers of the whole country could no longer tell with certainty which brother's promise they were buying. The younger man's box and the doctor's box carried the same name, and only one of them could keep it. If you have followed this account from a doctor's experimental kitchen to the morning the family name went onto a grocer's shelf against its owner's will, you have reached the exact seam where the empire begins to come apart, and I would ask you to subscribe before it does. What the 2 brothers were about to carry into the courtrooms of Michigan is only the smaller of the 2 ruins waiting in this story. The larger one, the use to which the doctor would put the authority of everything he had built, is the part the century has worked hardest to forget, and it is the ground the next chapters walk onto. The courts took the better part of a decade to settle what the brothers between them could not. From about 1910, the litigation ran on and off, through filing and appeal and counterclaim, a slow grinding contest over the right to sell cereal under the name Kellogg, and it climbed at last to the Michigan Supreme Court itself. The question the justices were handed was, on its face, a narrow commercial one, and underneath it was as old as any inheritance dispute in the record. Which of 2 men born to the same father was entitled to the one thing the father's name had become worth? When the decision came down, it came down against the doctor. The court granted Will Keith the exclusive right to the family name in the cereal trade, and John Harvey, who had made the name mean what it meant, was barred from selling his own breakfast foods under the surname he had carried since birth. It was a reversal complete enough to look, from a certain distance, like a parable. The junior, the drudge, who had kept the ledgers and swept the floors and stood at the rollers unnoticed, walked out of the litigation owning the name, the flake, and the breakfast table of the nation. The doctor kept the sanitarium, the white suit, the lectures, and the doctrine, and lost the one small toasted thing that would outlast every other work of his life. He had called his brother a fixture for 25 years, and had been correct about everything except which of them the century would remember, and by the time the courts finished, the 2 men had stopped speaking, an estrangement that would never close, that would harden through the decades ahead until it stood as permanent as anything either of them had built. The doctor had now lost the doctrine to Post, the industry to the 80 imitators of Cereal City, and the name to his own brother. What remained to him was the sanitarium and the immense authority it still conferred, the presidents and industrialists who still came, the fortune that still flowed, the standing of a man whose word on the human body a nation had learned to trust. He was 70 years into a certainty that had never once admitted a doubt. And it was precisely that undiminished authority, that money and that trust, that he would now gather up and pour into a project beside which the loss of a serial name would come to seem a small and almost innocent thing. Chapter 9. The Crusade to Perfect the Race. For nearly 40 years the doctor had practiced his medicine upon the single body. He had regulated one patient's diet and one patient's bowels, prescribed the one man's exercise and the one woman's rest, and held, as the first article of his faith, that a human being brought into alignment with what he called biologic law could be made clean, efficient, and whole. In 1914, he enlarged the patient. He turned from the body of the individual who came to Battle Creek to the body of the nation that did not, and the instrument he built to treat it he named the Race Betterment Foundation. He did not build it alone. Beside himself, he set two men who carried between them the very authorities he most wanted to borrow. One was the economist Irving Fisher, who lent the enterprise the credentials of the Academy and the vocabulary of national efficiency. The other was the eugenicist Charles Davenport, who lent it the machinery of the new science of heredity, the pedigree charts and the filing cards by which a family's inheritance could be reduced to a record. With these two, the doctor established the Race Betterment Foundation at Battle Creek in 1914, seated it beside the sanitarium, funded it from the same cereal fortune, and clothed it in the same white-coated authority that the country had already learned to trust on the question of its breakfast. The authority itself remained his, entire and formidable. The standing of the physician a nation believed, the fortune the sanitarium still threw off, the presidents and industrialists who still answered his summons. The whole of it he now gathered up and turned upon this single work. The empire raised to perfect the individual was made the engine of a design to perfect the species. 3 times the foundation gathered the nation's authorities beneath the banner of race betterment. The first national conference on race betterment met in Battle Creek in 1914 in the shadow of the sanitarium itself, its sessions given over to the improvement of the human stock, as the sanitarium's lectures had been given over to the improvement of the human stomach. The second convened in 1915 upon the platform of the Great Exposition at San Francisco, carrying the doctrine out of Michigan and onto one of the largest public stages the age could offer. The third returned to Battle Creek in 1928. Across those 3 assemblies, the language of the wellness empire was extended without a seam from the diet of the individual to the breeding of the population. And the words the doctor had always used of a clogged colon or an overstimulated nerve, the words degeneracy and purity and efficiency, the clean line and the tainted one, were now spoken of families, of classes, and of races. At the center of the work, the foundation set out to build a registry. Acting in concert with the Eugenics Record Office, it proposed to record the American stock as a stockman records a herd, to catalog families by their inheritance and to certify the sound among them, a register of the fit kept against the unfit, so that the breeding of Americans might be conducted with the same deliberation the doctor had always demanded of their eating. The impulse was old in him. He had spent his life sorting the wholesome from the corrupting, the permitted food from the forbidden, the clean habit from the secret one, and now the same sorting was turned upon human beings themselves and given a filing system. What the registry sorted, the doctrine proposed to act upon. From the foundation's platforms, the remedy was named plainly: It called for the sterilization of those judged unfit to reproduce, so that the taint might be stopped in the body that carried it. It called for the segregation of the races, so that the stock the doctrine counted sound should not mingle with the stock it counted degenerate. The man who had built a marble palace to cleanse the individual body of its impurities now proposed to cleanse the national body of the human beings he had come to regard as impurities within it, and he proposed it in the same even, confident, clinical voice, from behind the same standing as the most trusted physician in America. There was no contradiction between the two enterprises. The sanitarium and the foundation ran upon a single idea. Both held that a living thing was perfected by the removal of whatever corrupted it, that pleasure and weakness and taint were diseases of a common character, and that a sufficiently rigorous authority held both the right and the duty to cut them away. He had begun his career forbidding a man his coffee and his tobacco. He proposed to end it, forbidding whole categories of human beings their children. The road between those 2 points ran straight, laid plank by plank across half a century, every plank the same unbending assurance he had carried since he was a young man in a white coat. The Race Betterment Foundation was not a strange late turning in the doctor's mind, a fever that seized him near the end and passed. It was the doctrine of biologic living followed to the furthest place it led. And in 1928, the very year its third conference sat once more in Battle Creek, the doctor was pouring that same undoubting certainty into stone, raising above his sanitarium a tower to house the empire at what he took to be its summit, wholly unaware that the ground beneath the whole of it had already, and in silence, begun to give way. Chapter 10. The tower raised too late. At the very hour the doctor stood at what he believed to be the summit of his life's work, he decided that the summit was not yet high enough. The sanitarium had grown across half a century from a modest reform institute into a palace that received the powerful of a nation, and in the last years of the 1920s, with the Race Betterment conferences behind him and his name spoken as the most trusted in American medicine, he resolved to crown it. He would raise above the existing buildings a great new addition, a tower of many floors that would carry hundreds more rooms and stand over the town as the visible sign of everything he had made. He was near his 80th year. He built as a man builds who has never once been contradicted by the world, and who has no reason to expect that he ever will be. The addition rose in stone and steel above the older halls, taller than anything Battle Creek had known, a monument raised to permanence. Everything the doctor had preached across his career was written into its scale. He had spent 50 years telling a nation that the body could be perfected, that decline was not fate, but negligence, that a rigorous enough discipline could hold decay forever at bay. Now, he answered the one question a man of nearly 80 might have been expected to ask, the question of what came after him, by building as though nothing came after him at all. The tower was the doctrine turned to architecture. It assumed, in every course of its masonry, that the stream of patience and fortune and deference that had filled the sanitarium for a generation would go on filling it without end. The money to raise it was not money he had. It was money borrowed against the years still to come, secured on the confidence that those years would arrive exactly as the years behind him had, each bringing more guests than the last. That confidence had never yet been wrong. Patronage had climbed from barely 100 souls in the early days to thousands in a single season. The beds had filled faster than he could add them. The famous had come, and the ordinary had followed the famous. To a man who had watched that curve rise for 50 years without a break, a debt taken on to build more rooms was not a gamble at all. It was simply the next obvious expense of a growth he took to be a law of nature. He signed the institution to obligations that could only be met if the future behaved like the past. There was an old irony in it, and the doctor could not see the old irony any more than he could see the new danger. He had built his entire authority upon the sin of excess. He had warned the powerful against the extra helping, the second cup, the appetite indulged past its need. He had taught that ruin entered the body precisely through the door of wanting more than was sound. And here, at the end, he committed the great work of his life to an excess of exactly that kind, an appetite for more stone and more scale and more monument than the ground beneath it could safely bear, and he committed it with the same untroubled certainty he had once used to forbid a guest his coffee. The discipline he had imposed without mercy upon 10,000 other bodies he did not think to impose upon his own creation. He could not know what was coming, and in fairness, almost no one could. But the timing of what he had done left no margin at all. The new rooms would have to be filled, the borrowed money would have to be repaid, and both depended wholly upon the continued arrival of a wealthy clientele with the leisure and the fortune to take a long cure in Michigan. That clientele was about to vanish. Within a very short time of the tower's completion, the markets would break, and the long descent would begin that emptied the pockets of exactly the class of people who had made the sanitarium what it was. The palace had been enlarged to receive a flood of guests in the precise season that the flood was about to stop. So the last great structure of the doctor's empire went up bright and full and unshadowed, its new floors ready, its debt fresh, its owner certain, at the one moment when everything it assumed was ceasing to be true. He stood at the top of it and saw a summit. The people who filled his rooms were living on paper wealth that was about to prove imaginary, and when it proved imaginary they would not come, and when they did not come the rooms would stand empty, and the debt would stand due. The tower had been raised too late to be anything but a marker of how high he had climbed before the fall. It waited now, finished and gleaming and mortgaged, for the winter that was coming to take it, and for the court that would arrive to read out the price of a confidence that had never once, in 50 years, learned how to bend. Chapter 11. The Winter That Emptied the Palace. The winter came, and it came exactly as the market had promised it would. The wealth that had filled the sanitarium for a generation was the first wealth the Depression took, because it was the most purely optional wealth in the country. A long cure in Michigan was a thing a fortune bought when a fortune felt secure, and after the autumn of 1929, almost no fortune in America felt secure. The industrialists and their wives who had arranged their mornings around the doctor's rules now had ledgers of their own to save, and they stopped coming. The thin stream of guests that remained could not carry a palace that had been built to receive thousands. The numbers that had once measured the empire's rise now measured its emptying, and they read the same scale backward. In 1906, the place had taken in 7,006 guests across a single year. It had held 1,250 patients at one time, tended by a staff of 1,800, and had entered a President of the United States in its register as its 100,000th arrival. Every one of those figures had been offered as proof of the doctrine, a count the doctor could point to as evidence that the nation had come around at last to his creed. Now the same halls that had received 100,000 stood through whole days barely touched. The dining room where he had moved in a white suit and set dry flaked corn before the powerful of the age went quiet. The great tower he had raised on borrowed money held floor upon floor of rooms that no one arrived to fill. The tower had been the wager, and the wager failed almost as soon as it was made. It had been raised against a future that was supposed to behave like the past, and the future refused. The borrowed money did not care that the guests had gone. It came due on its own schedule, indifferent to the depression that had made it impossible to pay. For half a century, the doctor had watched his patronage climb without a single broken year, and he had built as though the climb were a law of nature. The law, it turned out, had only ever been a habit, and now the habit had ended. On the 4th of February, 1933, a court did to the institution what the doctor's own discipline never had. It stepped in over the sanitarium and placed it in receivership, the legal condition of a body that can no longer meet what it owes, its affairs lifted out of the hands that had run them and set under the control of the court and the men the court appointed. The institution that John Harvey Kellogg had built across more than half a century, that he had rebuilt larger after the fire, that he had crowned with a tower in his 80th year, passed out of his command by an order he had not written and could not refuse. He had governed every hour of every guest who ever entered the place. He no longer governed the place itself. There was a hard symmetry in the shape the ruin took. The man who had made obedience the first condition of his cure, who had held presidents and industrialists to a schedule as exact as the reading of an instrument, was now the one required to yield. The institution that had told the wealthiest men in America what they might eat and when they might rest was itself declared unable to manage its own affairs and handed to strangers to manage. Across 50 years, the doctrine had held that a rigorous enough control could keep collapse forever at bay. The collapse came anyway, and it came first to the doctrine's own address, to the marble halls where the discipline had been preached and sold. Losing control was not the end of it. It was only the opening of a longer thing. What followed the receivership was not a clean fall, but a slow one, a wreck picked over through the rest of the decade in the language of creditors and courts. The debts, the buildings, the future of the place, the very question of what the sanitarium now was and who could claim it, ground through proceeding after proceeding across the 1930s. The structure that had been a national doctrine was reduced to a contested asset, argued over while the years passed, and the doctor grew old watching. He had raised the thing by a single unbending will, and he was made to see it taken apart by many hands. There was no 1 hour he could point to as the moment it was lost. There was only the long record of a decade spent losing it. And yet the deepest of his losses had come before any court arrived at the sanitarium door, and it had come from inside his own house. The name carried on that door, the name the whole country now read each morning on a box at the breakfast table, was no longer his alone. Years before the Depression emptied his halls, another court had already taken from him the more valuable thing and given it to the brother he had valued least of all, the unpaid drudge who had kept his ledgers and swept the floors of his kitchen. The sanitarium the receivers now carried off had been the empire the doctor built on purpose. The name they could not carry off because it was already gone from him had been lost to the one man in all the world he had never once thought to guard against. Chapter 12. The Brothers Who Never Spoke Again. The name the doctor had lost did not sit idle in the hands that took it. Through the same 1930s in which the receivers picked the sanitarium apart, the other Kellogg company, the one the drudge had built, was growing into one of the most recognized names in America, printed each morning on a box in kitchens the doctor would never enter. The depression that emptied the health palace did not empty the breakfast table. Families that could no longer afford a long cure in Michigan could still afford a box of flakes, and they bought them by the millions, so that the fortune rose on the very years that ruined the doctor's own. Will Keith Kellogg had done the one thing his brother's doctrine forbade. He had made the flake taste good. The cornflake the doctor had served dry and unsweetened as a food to quiet the body, the younger brother had coated with sugar and sold as a pleasure, and the pleasure was what the country wanted. Every box that reached a table carried the family name, and carried, folded invisibly inside it, the exact appetite the doctor had spent a lifetime trying to cure. The town that had grown up around the sanitarium's gospel of restraint now ran on the opposite trade. Battle Creek had become Cereal City, and its largest fortune was built on making the body want more. The reversal ran deeper than money, though the money was vast. The brother who had kept the ledgers and swept the kitchen floor, the one John Harvey had barely troubled to notice, now commanded a fortune the sanitarium at its height had never approached, and he set about giving it away. While the doctor's institution slid toward the receivers, Will Keith established a foundation to spend the cereal fortune on children, on their health and their schooling, and it grew into one of the largest charitable trusts in the country. He put the purpose of it plainly. "I'll invest my money in people," he said. The doctor, who had fostered 42 children and adopted 7, and who had poured the authority of his empire into a foundation for breeding a better human stock, lived to watch the brother he had ruled turn the same family name toward the plainest kind of care. One Kellogg Foundation had set out to perfect the race. The other set out to feed and teach the children already here. They carried the same name because a court had ruled the name belonged to one man alone. The record of the feud leaves 2 readings of it, and it does not settle which is true. If you have ever watched a family business break a family in 2, tell me which brother you think the court got right. Was the younger one a thief who took the doctor's method and the doctor's name and grew rich on an appetite the doctor despised? Or was he the only Kellogg who understood that a food built to punish the body would never sell until it was allowed to please it, and who had earned the name he had spent his youth serving in silence? The Michigan Supreme Court settled the narrow question of who could print the word Kellogg on a cereal box. It never pretended to settle the other one. Whatever the answer, the 2 men never made their peace. The lawsuits ran their course by about 1920. The estrangement did not end with them. For the rest of their long lives, the brothers lived in the same small city, their shared name on its institutions and its factories and its cereal boxes, and they did not reconcile. The doctor grew old inside the wreck of the thing he had built, stripped of the sanitarium and stripped of the name, and he did not stop. He went on lecturing, went on prescribing, went on certain to the end that the body was a machine to be disciplined, and that he alone had known how. On the 14th of December, 1943, John Harvey Kellogg died in Battle Creek at the age of 91. He had outlived the sanitarium's glory, outlived the fire and the rebuilding and the marble tower, outlived his hold on the name, and outlived nearly everyone who had once come to him for the cure. He was gone, and the thing that survived him made the shape of his life plain almost at once. The name went on without him, louder in death than it had ever been in his life, on a cereal box in every grocery in the country, and on nothing he had ever meant it for. What Battle Creek would do with the empty palace he left behind, and what the century would choose to carry of the man, and what it would quietly agree to forget, was the last of the story. Chapter 13. The Name That Outlived the Man. The grand dining hall, where the doctor in the white suit had once set a bowl of dry flaked corn before the most powerful men in America, did not remain a dining hall. When the Second World War came, the government took the great building that had been the Battle Creek Sanitarium, the palace that had registered a president as its 100,000th guest, and held 1,250 patients under a staff of 1,800, and it made the place the Percy Jones Army Hospital. The halls that had served the mandated regimen to Edison and to Ford filled instead with soldiers carried home from the fighting to be put back together. When the war was over, the building did not return to what it had been. It passed to the federal government and became a federal center, and a federal center it remains, a warren of offices and corridors where a physician had once promised the sick that the appetite for pleasure could be cured out of them. The doctrine that had raised the place did not outlive it. What outlived it was the accident. The dry flake that had come out of the experimental kitchen as a byproduct of the war on excitement went out into the world, sweetened, sold under the younger brother's name, and it did not stop at the borders of the country or the century. It crossed the oceans and settled onto tables in nations the doctor had never seen, until a thing devised to quiet the human body was eaten each morning by more of the human race than anything the sanitarium had ever set upon a plate. The building that had made the name mean health was now a government office. The flake that had made the name mean breakfast had conquered the world. Not all of what he built traveled with the flake. The foundation he had raised in 1914 to breed a better human stock, the 3 great conferences, and the registry of the fit and the unfit, and the certainty that some lives were worthier than others of being lived, did not become part of the story the country chose to tell about the man on the cereal box. It was set down and stepped over, folded into a chapter of the century that the century would rather leave closed, and the millions who ate the flake each morning ate it, knowing nothing of the crusade the same hand had led. The name kept the breakfast and shed the rest of what its owner had meant it to stand for. The town kept the industry. The small Michigan place that had once ordered its mornings by one doctor's rules had drawn, in the boom his methods set off, more than 80 companies racing to flake and toast and sell, and when the boom had thinned and the failures had fallen away, what was left was a city that made cereal for the world and answered, ever after, to the name Cereal City. The sanitarium was gone from it. The doctrine was gone from it. The breakfast that the doctrine had thrown off by accident stayed, and built a town around itself, and outlasted every man who had ever quarreled over it. There are people who hold the last of this closer than any record can. The families in Battle Creek whose town still carries the name, the descendants of those who took the cure inside those walls, and of the 1800 who kept the great machine of the place running through its richest years, and the far larger number, scattered across the world, whose own morning still begins with the surname the 2 brothers went to court over. What the documents could not keep, those memories still might, and what they carry belongs beside the rest of the account. The white suit is gone, and the Hall of Presidents is a corridor of federal desks, and the doctrine that governed every bowl once set down in it is a thing the century laid aside and did not take up again. What outlasted John Harvey Kellogg was never the empire he had built to cure the world of its hunger for pleasure. It was the small, dry flake he had meant to be the cure, set now before the whole of that world each morning, under his name, in the one meaning he had never intended it to carry.